Oak. The Kansas wind in the summer of 1873 did not blow so much as it attacked. It came off the open flats in long, scorching waves that turned the prairie grass brittle and brown and sucked the moisture from a person's lips before they had finished drawing a breath. Delia Marsh had 6 chickens left, a half-filled water barrel going green at the bottom, and a 7-year-old boy named Cobb who had stopped asking when supper would be ready because he already knew the answer. Oak. She was 23 years old and felt 40. Oak. The drought had been working on them since March. By June, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Marsh homestead, the creek her late husband, Franklin, had staked his entire future on, had shrunk to a muddy trickle that the chickens refused to drink. By July, it was gone entirely. What remained was a cracked, gray scar in the earth that looked less like a waterway and more like a wound that had given up trying to heal. Oak. Franklin had been dead 11 months, a rattlesnake bite, of all the undignified ways for a hard-working man to leave the world. He had been clearing brush along the fence line, and the snake had been faster. By the time Cobb had run to fetch Delia, Franklin's leg was already swollen to twice its size, and by nightfall he was gone. The county doctor arrived the following afternoon, looked at the body, wrote something in his ledger, and left without saying a word that mattered. Oak. The land was hers now, the debt was hers too. $800 owed to the Grover County Land and Cattle Trust, an institution that was, for all practical purposes, the personal empire of one Harlan Drett. Drett was a heavy-set man with a wide, affable face and small, calculating eyes that never quite matched the warmth of his smile. Oak. He owned the largest ranch in the county, the only functioning mill within 40 miles, and, according to rumor that Delia had no reason to disbelieve, every elected official from the county sheriff down to the water assessor. Oak. He had ridden out personally 3 weeks after Franklin's funeral, hat in hand, expression carefully arranged into something resembling sympathy. Oak. Mrs. Marsh, he had said, standing in the doorway of the cabin with the afternoon sun behind him so that she had to squint to see his face. I want you to know that I hold Franklin in the highest regard, hardest working man I ever extended credit to. But the trust has obligations of its own. The note comes due in November. I'd hate to see you and the boy put out before winter. Oak. We'll have the money, Delia had told him, because there was nothing else to say. Oak. Drett had nodded slowly, replacing his hat. I certainly hope so, Mrs. Marsh. I certainly do. He had glanced past her into the dim interior of the cabin, his small eyes moving over every corner of it with the quiet efficiency of a man taking inventory. Then he smiled, turned, and rode away. Oak. She had watched him go and felt a cold, specific dread settle into her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the look in his eyes when he thought she wasn't watching. Oak. That had been 8 months ago. Now it was August, the creek was dead, the chickens were dying one by one, and the cornfield. Franklin's great hope, the thing he had talked about through 2 entire winters, was a field of gray, rattling stalks that produced nothing worth harvesting. Oak. Delia was returning from the eastern fence line on a Tuesday afternoon, the iron axe balanced on her shoulder and an empty bucket in her hand when she saw the horse. Oak. It was standing at the far edge of the property near the old cottonwood, a big, dark roan with an expensive saddle still strapped to its back. The reins were trailing on the ground. The horse was trembling. Oak. Delia set down the bucket and gripped the axe handle with both hands. Her first thought was horse thieves, which meant men, which meant trouble. She scanned the fence line, the scrub brush, the dry creek bed. Nothing moved. Oak. Then she heard it, a low, grinding sound, barely human, more like the sound a door makes when the hinges have rusted through. Oak. She found him on the far side of the cottonwood, half hidden in the dead grass. A man face down, one arm stretched out as though he had been reaching for something when he fell. He wore a long trail duster that was dark with blood across the back and left side. A badge was pinned to his chest. She could see the glint of it even from 5 feet away. Oak. A lawman. Oak. Her instincts told her to leave him. A wounded lawman meant someone had wounded him, and whoever that was could still be close. But the man's hand moved then, just barely, his fingers curling slowly against the cracked earth, and the sound he made was not threatening. It was the sound of something that had nearly stopped. Oak. Lord, give me strength, Delia muttered, and dropped to her knees beside him. Oak. She managed to roll him onto his back. He was lean and long-boned, with a deeply weathered face and dark hair matted to his forehead with sweat and dried blood. He had been shot twice, once in the left shoulder, once low on the right side, and whoever had done it had not bothered to verify their work before riding off. His breathing was shallow and fast, like a man running in his sleep. His eyes opened briefly. They were dark brown, almost black, and entirely unfocused. His lips moved. The ledger, he said. The words came out blurred and broken. Don't let Dret have the ledger. The name struck her like a hand across the face. Dret. She looked at the badge on his chest. United States Deputy Marshal, it read. Lucius Crail. Delia Marsh made her decision in the time it took the roan horse to exhale through its nose. She pushed to her feet, grabbed the trailing reins, and led the horse around the cottonwood. It took her the better part of an hour, and every ounce of strength she possessed, to get Lucius Crail across the saddle and walk him, draped and half-conscious, back to the cabin. Mama? Cobb appeared in the doorway, his eyes going wide at the sight of the blood-soaked stranger hanging over the saddle. Is he dead? Not yet, Delia said. Come help me. They got him inside and onto the floor by the cold hearth. Cobb, who was small for 7 but steady in a crisis the way some children simply are, held the lantern without being asked while Delia cut the duster away with her sewing shears. The wounds were bad, but not, she thought, immediately fatal. She had helped her mother birth calves and had once dug a fishhook out of Franklin's palm without flinching. This was worse, but the principle was the same. She sterilized a darning needle in the flame of the lantern. She used the last of the whiskey Franklin had kept in the tin box beneath the bed. When she poured it over the wounds, Lucius Crail came fully awake for approximately 30 seconds, his whole body going rigid, a sharp, strangled sound tearing through his clenched teeth. His hand shot out and found her wrist, gripping it with a strength that seemed impossible for a man in his condition. Easy, Delia said, firmly and without flinching. You're in a private home. I'm taking the bullets out. You can let go of my arm, or I can stop what I'm doing. Your choice, Marshal. His grip loosened. His eyes, dark and wild with pain, found her face and stayed there. Then he passed out again. She worked through the twilight and into the dark. Cobb fell asleep in the rocking chair with the lantern still in his hand, and Delia gently took it from him before it could tip. By the time she had packed and bound the wounds with strips torn from her last good apron, the moon was high and her hands were shaking with exhaustion. She sat back on her heels and looked at the unconscious man on her floor. Then she looked at the leather saddlebag she had brought in from the horse. The one he had been clutching when she first found him, the strap still wrapped around his wrist. She hesitated, then she opened it. Inside was a journal, a thick cloth-bound thing with a brass clasp, and beneath it a folded document that bore the official seal of the United States Department of the Interior. She unfolded it carefully. It was a water rights survey, a formal, government-commissioned assessment of every functioning water source in Grover County, Kansas. The annotations were meticulous, done in 2 different hands, an official surveyor's clean script and, overlaying it in sharp, slanted pencil, notes in what she assumed was Crail's own hand. The notes told a story. Harlan Dret had, over the course of 4 years, filed false property surveys with the county recorder's office. The filings redirected water access rights away from the small homesteads along the Lower Creek Plain and consolidated them under 3 parcels he held in other men's names. The effect was deliberate and precise. Without legal water access, the small farmers could not qualify for the territorial irrigation grants that the federal government had been distributing since 1870. Without those grants, they could not survive the drought. Without surviving the drought, they had no choice but to sell. And Dret was always there, ready to buy, at a price so low it barely covered the debt he had arranged for them to carry in the first place. He had done it to 8 families in 4 years. Franklin's name was in the journal, Franklin Marsh. Cross-referenced against a falsified survey filed 18 months before his death, quietly stripping the legal water access from the Marsh property and transferring it, on paper, to a holding company with no listed officers. Delia read the entry 3 times. Her hands had stopped shaking. Something colder and harder had taken the place of the exhaustion. She was still sitting there in the small hours of the morning, the journal open across her knees, when Lucius Crail's voice came from the floor. You found it. She looked at him. He was watching her from beneath half-closed lids, too tired to hold his head up, but conscious enough to see what was in her hands. Oak, who are you? He asked. His voice was rough, scraped down. Oak, Delia Marsh. She paused. My husband's name is in your journal. Oak, a long silence. Franklin Marsh. Oak, yes. Oak, I'm sorry. He said it simply, without the careful packaging that people usually wrapped condolences in. Just 2 words, flat and honest. He was one of the 8 families I was building the case around. Someone at the land office tipped Dredd off. His men caught up to me 2 days out of Wichita. Oak, how many men does he have? Oak, 4 that I know of. Paid guns. He keeps them on the ranch payroll as farmhands. Crail shifted slightly and winced hard. Mrs. Marsh, the men who shot me are going to come looking for me when I don't turn up dead. If they find me here. Oak, then we'd better make sure they don't find you, Delia said. Oak, he looked at her for a moment. I have 2 bullet holes in me. Oak, I know. I put the stitches in. She closed the journal and set it on the table. Drink this water, Marshal Crail, and don't move more than you have to. I need you alive. You're the only one who can present that evidence to someone who outranks Harlan Dredd. Oak. The fever came on toward dawn, as fevers do, and lasted 3 days. Delia barely slept. She kept the cabin shuttered and the fire low, cooling Lucius Crail's face with wet cloths, while he moved in and out of consciousness, muttering half-formed sentences about county clerks and forged signatures and a man named Teller, who had apparently witnessed something important in a Wichita courthouse. Oak. On the 2nd day, Cobb stopped being afraid of the man on the floor and started being curious instead. He sat at a careful distance, watching the marshal with the solemn, intense attention that children reserve for things they cannot categorize. On the 3rd morning, he crept close enough to get a proper look at the badge. Oak, are you a real lawman? Cobb asked. Oak. Crail opened one eye. His color was still wrong, but the fever had broken in the night, and the worst was behind him. Last time I checked. Oak. Have you ever shot anyone? Oak. Cobb, Delia said from the stove without turning around. Oak. It's a reasonable question, Crail said. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. The answer is yes. Only men who were shooting at me first. Oak. Cobb considered this with great seriousness. That seems fair. Oak. Delia turned then, a ladle in her hand, and found Lucius Crail looking not at Cobb but at her, with an expression she couldn't name, something between awareness and restraint. She turned back to the stove. Oak. By the 5th day, he was sitting up in the rocking chair, still pale but present. Delia told him everything she had pieced together from the journal. The timeline of the false surveys, the names of the holding companies, the pattern of foreclosures that followed each filing. Crail listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Oak. You understood all of that? He asked, not condescending, genuinely careful. Oak. My father was a land attorney in Ohio, Delia said flatly. Before I married Franklin and followed him west, I spent 3 years copying his case documents. I know what a false survey looks like. Oak. Crail looked at her with a different kind of attention. You might be more useful than you realize, Mrs. Marsh. Oak. I already know I'm useful, she said. What I need to know is whether the evidence you have is enough to take to a federal court. Oak. It would be if I can get back to Wichita. Oak. And if Drett's men find you before that? Oak. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Oak. On the 7th morning, the sound of horses came up the eastern road. Oak. Delia was outside throwing grain to the remaining chickens when she heard it. She counted 3 riders before she had even turned fully around. She walked to the cabin door at a measured pace, not running, because running would tell them something, and stepped inside. Oak. 3 riders, she said quietly, coming from the Drett Road. Oak. Crail was already on his feet, moving with the stiff, deliberate caution of a man whose body was ahead of his healing but behind his instincts. He had his gun in his hand, a heavy Remington that Delia had retrieved from his saddlebag and kept on the high shelf above the door. He checked the cylinder and looked at her. Oak. The boy, he said. Oak. Cobb. Delia knelt in front of her son, taking his face in both hands. He was looking at her with wide, steady eyes. I need you to go into the root cellar and stay there until I come for you. Do you understand me? No matter what you hear, you stay. Oak. Yes, Mama, he said. He did not cry. He picked up his carved wooden mule, a thing Franklin had made him the winter before, and climbed down the ladder without another word. Oak. Delia lowered the trapdoor and pulled the braided rug over it with her foot. Oak. She opened the cabin door before the riders could reach the porch. Oak. There were 3 of them. She recognized the one in front. A heavyset man named Galt Presser, who had worked for Dret for as long as anyone could remember, and who had a habit of standing too close when he spoke to women. The other 2 she didn't know. They were younger, with the loose, watchful stillness of men hired for a specific purpose. Mrs. Marsh. Presser pulled his horse up at the edge of the yard, taking in the shuttered windows and the closed door with a slow, practiced scan. Hot morning to keep the shutters up. Sick child, Delia said. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, the axe leaning against the doorframe within easy reach. What do you want, Mr. Presser? Mr. Dret sent us to check on you. Heard you might be having some trouble. His eyes moved to the roan horse in the small corral beside the barn. The horse was still there. She had not been able to move it without drawing exactly this kind of attention. That's a fine animal for a widow woman to come by. Stray, Delia said. Wandered in 2 nights ago. I plan to report it to the county office. Presser swung down from his horse. Mind if we take a look around? I do mind, Delia said. You're not the county sheriff. You have no authority on this property. Mr. Dret has a financial interest in this property, Presser said, and the warmth had gone entirely out of his voice. He was walking toward the porch now, slow and deliberate. We just want to make sure everything's in order. The cabin door opened behind Delia. Lucius Crail stepped out onto the porch. He looked terrible, pale and tight around the eyes, but he stood straight, and his badge caught the morning sun clearly enough to be read from 15 feet away. His Remington was at his side. He did not raise it. Deputy Marshal Lucius Crail, he said. His voice was steady and carrying. These men are interfering with a federal investigation, Mrs. Marsh. I'd like you to step back inside. The effect on the 3 riders was instantaneous and different in each man. The younger 2 went rigid, their hands stilling. Presser stopped walking. You're supposed to be dead, Presser said. I get that a lot. Crail held Presser's gaze. Tell your employer that I have the ledger, the surveys, and the sworn statement of the Wichita land clerk. Tell him that the U.S. Marshal's office in Wichita has a sealed copy of everything in my saddlebag, opened only if I fail to report in within the week. Tell him he has until Friday to turn himself in to the county sheriff, or federal agents will come to him instead. He paused. Now get off this woman's land. Presser stood very still for a long moment. The 2 younger men were already easing their horses back toward the road. Then Presser turned very slowly and walked back to his horse. He mounted without a word. He did not look at Delia again. The 3 of them rode back the way they had come. Delia let out a breath she had been holding since she opened the door. Was any of that true? She asked quietly. The sealed copy in Wichita? The part about the land clerk is true, Crail said. He lowered himself carefully onto the porch step, and she noticed the fresh blood seeping through the bandage at his side. The sealed copy is what I told them it was, an incentive. You're bleeding again. I noticed. She went inside and came back with fresh linen and the small bottle of carbolic solution she had been rationing carefully. She knelt beside him on the step without ceremony and began unwrapping the bandage. He sat still and let her work. You knew Dret sent that scouting party to verify I was dead, Crail said after a moment. You knew it the second you saw them coming. Of course I knew. And you opened the door anyway. You stood there and held the line until I could back you up. He was looking at the side of her face. Most people would have hidden. I have a 7-year-old child in a root cellar, Delia said. She pressed the clean linen firmly against the wound. I don't have the option of hiding. He didn't say anything else, but something settled in his expression that had not been there before. 3 days later, Presser rode back alone. He came at mid-morning, which meant he did not come to cause trouble. Men who come to cause trouble come at night or at dusk, when the light is ambiguous. He came with a message. Harlan Dret wanted to meet. He wants to negotiate, Presser said flatly, looking at a point somewhere above Delia's left shoulder. It was clear that delivering this message was not something Presser had enjoyed being assigned to do. The time for negotiating is when a man hasn't forged 8 land surveys and stolen water rights from families who trusted the county recorder's office, Crail said from the doorway. Tell him the offer stands. He turns himself in by Friday, or we go to him. Presser left. That night, Cobb fell asleep in front of the low fire. Delia sat at the table, going over the journal a third time, cross-referencing the survey dates against the foreclosure dates she had memorized from years of watching her neighbors slowly disappear. Crail sat across from her, and between them was the map of the county water lines that she had drawn from memory. Her father's training emerging in her hands like something that had been sleeping. Oak. You've been building this case yourself, Crail said. He was looking at the map. Oak. I didn't know I was building a case. I thought I was trying to understand what happened to Franklin. She traced one of the lines with her fingertip. He died 11 months ago. 3 months before that, he told me he had applied for the territorial irrigation grant and been told the property didn't qualify. He couldn't understand why. He thought he'd made a mistake in the original filing. She looked up. He spent the last summer of his life thinking it was his fault, Oak, that he had somehow failed us. Oak. Crail was quiet for a moment. He didn't fail you. Oak. I know that now. She closed the journal. I want to be in the room when this goes to the Federal Circuit Court. I want to testify. My father's name and my own knowledge of land law. That's worth something. Oak. It's worth a great deal, Crail said. Oak. She looked at him squarely. Is there a reason I couldn't do that? Oak. He met her gaze with equal directness. Not one that I can see. Oak. Friday came and went. Harlan Drett did not surrender himself to the county sheriff. Oak. On Saturday morning, Delia woke before dawn to the sound of movement outside. She was on her feet with the Sharps rifle before she was fully conscious, crossing the dark cabin floor in her stockings, pressing herself against the wall beside the shuttered window. Oak. Then she heard the horses. Not the controlled, quiet approach of men trying to conceal themselves, the open, deliberate approach of a group moving in formation. She eased the shutter open a crack. Oak. 6 riders. In the gray pre-dawn light, she could see the glint of badges on 4 of them. Oak. Lucius Crail appeared beside her. He looked out over her shoulder. Oak. That's Deputy Marshal Hargreaves out of Wichita, he said quietly. I sent a letter with the eastbound stage 3 days ago. Oak. You didn't tell me. Oak. You had enough to manage. Oak. She looked at him. He was watching the riders, his expression composed, and she thought that she had misjudged him in the first days. She had assumed that his quietness was reserve, the closed-off self-sufficiency of a man who moved through other people's crises without really seeing them. But it wasn't that. He had simply learned to be careful about what he allowed himself to show, the same way she had. Oak. Harlan Drett was arrested at his ranch house at sunrise. 2 of his hired men were taken at the same time. Presser rode out before the deputies arrived and was apprehended on the Wichita Road 2 hours later. Oak. The Federal Circuit Court convened in Dodge City 6 weeks after that. Delia Marsh took the stand in a blue wool dress she had pressed the night before, with her father's land survey methodology memorized down to the statute citations, and testified for 4 hours. The judge, a deliberate, unhurried man named Farnsworth, who had been hearing land cases since the 1850s, listened to every word without interruption. Oak. The ruling came down 3 days later. Oak. All falsified surveys were invalidated. The water rights were restored to the 8 affected properties. The holding companies Drett had used as legal shields were dissolved by court order, and the fraudulent debt instruments, including the $800 note that had been hanging over the Marsh property since Franklin died, were declared void. Oak. One of the surveyor's assistants came to find her in the courthouse hallway afterward. He handed her a folded document and told her it was the federal irrigation grant, approved retroactively for the Marsh property, backdated to the original application date. The amount was enough to see them through 2 years of drought and build the secondary well that Franklin had always planned. Oak. She stood in that hallway for a long time with the document in her hands, and she did not cry. She had done her crying in private over the past 11 months, in the small hours of the morning, when Cobb was asleep and the cabin was quiet. There was nothing left of that particular grief that needed a public audience. Oak. When she walked outside, Lucius Crail was waiting on the courthouse steps. Oak. He was fully healed now, or as close to it as a man with 2 bullet scars was likely to get. He was wearing a clean duster and his hat, and his horse was saddled and packed at the hitching post. He had a new assignment, she knew, a land fraud case in the Nebraska territory that had been waiting while he recovered. Oak. You're riding north, she said. Oak. In the morning. He turned the hat in his hands. I wanted to see the verdict first. Oak. She stood beside him on the steps and looked out at the dusty main street of Dodge City, the wagons and the foot traffic, and the long, flat horizon beyond. The sky was enormous out here, the way it always was in Kansas. Big enough to make a person feel simultaneously very small and, strangely, less alone. Oak. Cobb asked me to give you something, she said. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a small figure carved from a cottonwood branch. It was rough and lopsided, clearly a child's work, but recognizably a horse. Oak. Crail took it. He turned it over in his hands with an expression that was difficult to read, and therefore, she suspected, genuine. Oak. He said it was for your roan, she said, so the horse had a companion. Oak. He looked up from the carved figure, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Oak. The Nebraska Territory is a long ride from Kansas, he said finally. Oak. Yes, Delia agreed. Oak. But the federal circuit brings me through Grover County twice a year, on official business. Oak. She looked at him. The morning light was coming in flat and clear across the rooftops, and it lit the weathered lines of his face without softening them, which she had come to appreciate about the Kansas light. It did not flatter or deceive, it only showed what was there. Oak. Then I expect we'll see you in the spring, Marshal Crail, she said. Oak. He put his hat on. I expect you will, Mrs. Marsh. Oak. He walked down the steps to his horse, tucking the small carved figure carefully into his breast pocket. Delia watched him go, one hand resting on the courthouse railing, the warm August wind moving through the street and carrying with it, faintly, the smell of distant rain. Oak. She stood there until he had turned at the far end of the street and disappeared from view. Then she straightened her shoulders, descended the steps, and went to find her son. Oak. The well was finished by October. By November, the first good rain in 18 months came down, across the Grover County flats in long, steady sheets that turned the dry creek bed back into something that ran and caught the light. Cobb stood on the porch watching it, his face tilted up, eyes closed. Oak. Delia stood beside him and thought of Franklin, not with the sharp, suffocating grief of the early months, but with the quiet, durable kind that settles into a person like stones settling into a riverbed. Present, permanent, part of the foundation. Oak. She had kept his land. She had spoken his name in a federal courtroom and made it mean something other than debt and defeat. She had done it herself, with her own hands and her father's knowledge, and the fierce, uncompromising love of a woman who had nothing left to lose and had chosen, anyway, to fight. Oak. The rain fell steadily through the evening, filling the new well, softening the cracked earth, running in bright threads down through the brown grass toward the creek. By morning, the creek was running again. Oak. And somewhere on the long road north through the Nebraska Territory, a deputy marshal with a carved wooden horse in his breast pocket would look up at the same rain and think about a courthouse in Dodge City, a blue wool dress, and a woman who had known exactly what she was doing from the moment she knelt in the dead grass beside a stranger and made the choice to pull him back from the edge of the dark. Oak. I keep thinking about the moment Delia found him. Not the dramatic part, not the gunfight, not the courthouse. Just that first moment when she heard the sound in the dead grass and had every reasonable excuse in the world to walk away. She had a child to protect. She had 6 chickens and a half-empty barrel and a debt that was swallowing her whole. Stopping made no logical sense, and she stopped anyway. Oak. That's the thing I can't get out of my head. The choice that looks like nothing, the choice made before anyone is watching, before there's any possible reward in sight. That's the one that changes everything downstream. Not because the universe is keeping score in any mystical sense, but because of something much simpler and much harder. The kind of person you choose to be in the small, unwitnessed moments is exactly the kind of person you'll be when it counts. Oak. Delia knelt in that dry Kansas grass and chose decency when decency was expensive, and every good thing that followed, the water rights restored, Franklin's name cleared, the well finished by October, traced directly back to that one decision made in the heat with no audience. Oak. What strikes me about her, though, isn't just the goodness of it, it's the intelligence. She didn't just feel the right things. She understood what she was looking at. When she opened that saddlebag, she could have seen a pile of documents and set them aside. Instead, she read them. She cross-referenced the survey dates against foreclosure timelines she had memorized from watching her neighbors disappear one by one. She drew the county water map from memory. Oak. That's her father's training, yes. But training only becomes useful when someone cares enough to retain it, and cares enough to apply it when the situation demands. Delia's mind was as much a part of her survival as her hands were. The willingness to understand your circumstances clearly, without flinching from what you find. That kind of clear-eyed thinking is not a passive gift. It has to be practiced. It has to be chosen, the same way she chose to kneel in the grass. And then there's what she carried for 11 months before any of this happened. A grief she had no time to sit with. A farm she did not know how to run alone. A son watching her face every morning to see if there was still a reason to hope. She did not collapse under that weight. She did not hand the land over to Dret in the first week, because it would have been easier. She held. Not because she was fearless. I don't think she was, not for a single day. But because she had decided, quietly and without ceremony, that she was not finished yet. That kind of endurance isn't loud. It doesn't look heroic from the outside. It looks like throwing grain to sick chickens in August heat. It looks like pressing clean linen against a stranger's wound at midnight. It looks like standing in a courthouse hallway holding a document and not crying, because the crying was already done, in private, over a year of difficult nights. What Delia's story shows me is that those three things, doing right by people, thinking clearly about the world, and refusing to quit, are not separate qualities. They braid together. Each one makes the other two possible. The goodness without the intelligence gets exploited. The intelligence without the endurance gets exhausted. The endurance without the goodness just becomes stubbornness in service of nothing. She had all three, and they brought her, eventually, to that courthouse step in the August sun, watching a man she trusted tuck a small carved horse into his breast pocket and ride north. Some things work out. Not always, and not for everyone. But they worked out for Delia Marsh because she was exactly the person she needed to be, and she had been that person long before anyone came along to notice.